we memorialized the first 5 months of COVID, of the pandemic, from January 2020 to May 2020. And the reason that we did that is because people are beginning to forget again what it was like at the very beginning, just like they forgot or weren't born yet at the beginning of the AIDS epidemic. And, you know, certainly a lot of people that are in healthcare today were not born or around or in healthcare during the HIV epidemic. And we will find the same thing happening with the COVID pandemic.
My Newark days or the experiences you guys have. So I look forward to
Where were you? Where did you work in Newark?
St. Michael's Medical Center. So the Peter Ho Clinic, which is very well known for HIV. And as you can imagine, Newark, you know, ground zero.
It's pronounced Newark, N-O-R-K, not Newark.
Oh, you're right. It's Newark, Delaware, Newark, New Jersey. So.
Newark.
Okay.
N-O-R-K, Newark.
No, you know, because I grew up in Maryland, so there's a Newark.
I grew up in Newark. I know.
You're a Newark man, huh?
No, I actually, let me take that back.
You grew up in West Orange.
My East Orange family will be disenfranchised. I went to medical school in Newark. So
I was going to say, you grew up in West Orange, I'm pretty sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So, ladies and gentlemen, this is Recommended Daily Dose. We have two lovely guests, Ellen Matzer and Valery Hughes, both registered nurses and authors of two books. The first book is Nurses on the Inside, Stories of HIV/AIDS Epidemic in NYC, which I think is, we see some definite similarities with the COVID pandemic. So we definitely want to get to that. And a new book, Beyond the Mask, which is a fictional psychological chronicle of 6 healthcare workers in a callous city hospital system. That sounds like where we work now. So welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're very excited to have you both here. I mean, authors, RNs, your background, and you know, it's very exciting to have you both on. So welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So tell us a little bit about your backgrounds. I think there's a lot to dive into here, and you know, my colleague here, Clinton, can get lost sometimes. So we want to stick to the subject matter. I'm just joking, Clinton, by the way. But no, but tell us your backgrounds and then you know how you got into your experiences with HIV and AIDS and this pandemic that, you know, now with COVID-19, people forget that, you know, New York was the epicenter.
The original COVID.
Exactly. And then, you know, how you transformed all that experience into these great books. And we want to hear about your books as well.
Sure. So Val and I, we've both been nurses. I from 1978 on, and Val 76 on. So I'm approaching 45 years, and Val is approaching over that. And we met. That
was very tactfully.
That was nice, Ellen. Thank you.
So we met in 1979, where I had just transferred to Roosevelt Hospital in New York City. And we were working both in critical care at that time when we started to see unusual presentations of men who came in after suffering from mostly men at that time.
I did my residency at Roosevelt, and I finished that in 2007.
Oh,
okay, so
we were long gone by then.
Long gone at our second HIV unit by then.
Are you talking like early 80s, around 81?
No, we're talking about late 70s, actually.
Right now, we're talking about late 70s. That's where we met in 79 when we started to see our first patients by late 79, early 1980, but we didn't know it at the time.
So tell us about, I would love, you know, as an infectious disease doc, someone who takes care of HIV. I mean, this is fascinating to me. I mean, predominantly, I'm assuming in a certain segment of the population, so men, how are they presenting? Was it like fevers unknown origin? Was it lymphadenopathy? Was all the above? Like what were they seeing?
Well,
by the time we saw them, they were getting ready to get intubated.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't, you know, look back on history for a while. I mean, we, you know, as an ICU, we were just told we were getting an intubated patient. And it was only when we looked back, when we realized what was happening, when we were able to get histories that, again, they had gone through that latency period of, you know, the flu-like syndrome, and they had already seen their primary care doctors, told to go home, take Tylenol, rest, drink fluids, etc. Sometimes they went back to their primary care, maybe got put on a course of antibiotics, some inhalers. And by the time we saw them, they were hypoxic, acidotic.
This was pre-Z-Pack, by the way.
Yeah.
And probably, I'm assuming that
PCP.
on the presenting,
It was.
it was probably PCP.
It was.
Right?
The first time, I mean, back then we didn't bronch people, so we didn't know until one case occurred where we actually, one doctor did perform a bronchoscopy and came back pneumocystis. And that was the first case we ever knew, and we couldn't figure out how somebody like that, it was a 62-year-old French physician who had pneumocystis by bronchoscopy. And we just figured at that time, because that was probably 80, that everybody was wondering, all right, well, we didn't think about the immune system. We just thought maybe pneumocystis had developed a new virulence. And that was a popular...
in immunocompetent people, right? Because obviously everyone known that it would be in immunocompromised patients, but there's no, I'm assuming there's no...
Remember back in those days, there were no big transplant patients,
Sure.
Right.
There wasn't any of that stuff. And so,
we didn't think about T cells. We didn't.
Yeah, nobody ever, there was no such thing as a B and T panel back then. All of that stuff was,
no biologics, no TNF inhibitors. Infectious disease was really infancy back then. So
in fact, nobody, we had one doc who was ID, and he was woefully underutilized up until this time.
Yeah.
And that was it. That's what we had.
Yeah. So we just, we just figured, we'd see a group of patients, and don't forget, in 1980, 81 and so forth, I mean, again, no social media, no electronic medical records, no cell phones, no interhospital communication, nothing.
Right.
So we thought what we were seeing was confined to our particular ICU, and that it would come and go, and that would be that. Little did we know that we were on a precipice of a major epidemic. We had no idea until we saw that article.
If you think about the things that we saw, we would see one patient, then a couple of months later, we might see another patient. And then I can remember once when you had that patient who you thought might have a toxic shock because you thought she might have a retained tampon, and we looked and there wasn't one, and it turns out that she was a person who does sex for money. And so and then there was a woman who we thought had psittacosis, for God's sake. And so it was a very weird constellation of presentations. Always high fevers, ground glass opacities, nothing sort of that you could put together and really understand. And while their CBCs were weird, it did not, I think in many cases, it didn't trigger the kind of workup. Well, there wasn't a workup to be done.
There wasn't. So
much of the laboratory stuff that you rely on all the time had not been developed.
Well, of course, I mean, at that time, when this was first described, no one knew about the etiology, right? The HIV-1.
That's right.
It came several years later with a French scientist.
How long? How long did it take for doctors and nurses to realize that this was HIV? Like, what is a timeline? Because it's not like now on Twitter we know in Wuhan there's an outbreak, and then next week it's going to be an outbreak here. Like,
I want to say 82.
So a few years. Wow.
Yeah. I mean, we saw some weirdnesses in 79, some more in 80, and in 81, of course, I left New York at that time. I went to work at a refugee camp in Thailand, a Cambodian refugee camp. And so I was gone for about 9 months. And then when I got back, HIV was well entrenched, and that was 81.
Yeah, 81, and then so
But they were calling it grids. There have been some letters. The MMWR had made some notations that there was Kaposi sarcoma noted in a peculiar distribution. And nobody even knew what KS was back then. They had no idea it was a virus too. So we were totally in the dark about everything. And
how was it received? Since, of course, we'll talk about it. Clinton and I always are very passionate about talking about disparities in healthcare and how, you know, pandemics like HIV and then of course COVID-19 and otherwise have revealed inequality in healthcare. But certainly in the early days, there was certain populations where there may and probably still exists some bias towards. And so how was this taken initially when initial cases were coming in either from lower socioeconomic, IVDU, MSM, you know, these populations?
Well, you can imagine. I mean, if you think that gay people are reviled now, you should have seen what it was like then. It was horrible. I mean, we'd go on rounds and there was this one particular person who would always say, well, what do you expect? And would make a crude comment about men who have sex with men. And it was just sort of very disheartening. And there was this other thing that went on. I don't know if you ever read The House of God, but there was this
the Fat Man was actually based upon Clinton's experiences in residencies.
And you're the Gomer that goes to the ground.
I'm the Gomer goes to ground.
Right.
I heard that right before my internship year. And you know, whether it's the Lasix dose, Gomers go to the ground, they can always hurt you more. First thing in a code, take your impulse. I know we're sidetracked, but that book is gold. It's absolute gold.
So would you characterize the population as vulnerable though, I guess?
Oh, well, yes, in very many ways.
Yeah.
Certainly the women who were sex workers definitely got the shaft. They were totally ignored. But there was a complete revulsion for people who were gay. And so once they started calling it grids, then, you know, they were a disposable population and we put them in the back room and that was that. And
I'm sorry,
just want to take care of them either.
Who may not be aware of that acronym. I mean, this is gay-related immunodeficiency. Is
right.
that what it would?
So that's what they called it before they called it.
Yes, grids. Yeah, that
I had not heard the term. That's
it was written in the charts. Grid, you know.
Really?
Right.
Wow.
Oh yeah, it was written in the chart. Grid for a good long time.
So a lot of gay men would never interact with the healthcare system. So the only time it was that they ever did was really at the end of their lives when someone called 911 and they were brought in. And you know, when people figured out what was going on, which I would have to say was 83, maybe between 82 and 83, pretty much a wholesale panic ensued. You couldn't get a glove for love or money because people wanted to wear 12 pairs of gloves to go to the scene. EMS was like that, and cops and firefighters and nurses too. I mean, a lot of nurses said, you know, I'm going to get this and die. And a lot of nurses left the profession because of it.
That sounds familiar to what's has happened in some regards.
So how do you guys feel when the COVID pandemic started? Did you see like similarities, or did you have flashbacks, or did you relive?
We were actually we were not on the front line. I'm teaching, so I was seeing initial in the nursing homes because that's where I teach in skilled facilities. But my daughter, who is a physician's assistant, was on the front line. My son, who works in radiology transport, was on the front line. And my husband, who's an x-ray tech, was also on the front line. So I was living it, and also my former ICU colleagues, because I worked at St. Francis in Roslyn for 17 years in critical care. So, you know, the book was done with interviews with some of my old colleagues and some colleagues that I met really on Facebook COVID groups. So yes, I mean, we certainly did see some of the similarities, but you know, just if you remember, I mean, all of a sudden, you know, in 1980s, we weren't counting the number of AIDS cases like you saw, like, you know, electoral votes, like you saw, you know, during the Trump administration, how many million, thousands, and then millions of people were getting it and then dying. But yes, I mean, the fear was present in many people back then during the HIV epidemic, and certainly more so during the COVID pandemic. And more nurses, I think, left nursing during COVID than they did during HIV. I mean, we had an overage of nurses back then. And when Val and I went to work at the second hospital, the first hospital was St. Clair's, by the way, which is the first designated AIDS center in New York City. And there,
I was going to say, I think St. Clair's closed, but I actually did a month of ICU there in early, actually, I was there right when the towers fell on 9/11. And
oh my God.
Yes, it was, anyway, there's a famous ICU book there when it went to med school in the late 90s or 2000s would read, and the gentleman who did ICU there was the gentleman who wrote the book. But I knew that St. Clair's occupied a very specific niche of this vulnerable population. I think it had always been known, but I was unaware that this was the first. You said HIV.
It was the first DAX, the Designated AIDS Center in New York City.
Right.
Even before St. Vincent's, which was the famous one, but
yes.
But we were the first, and I was the first nurse hired there as a staff nurse, and then I became the educator, and then I actually became the coordinator. And I was there for a little over 5 years before I was recruited to Lenox Hill Hospital to start their program. Back then, there was no DRG for AIDS, so it was very profitable for hospitals to open up designated centers, and they were competing for patients.
At any given time, reimbursement. It was a very different reimbursement.
At any given time, there were, in New York City, there were thousands of people with AIDS in the hospitals, thousands. I mean, we had in our unit, designated unit, we had 14 beds, but in any time, there could have been 60, 70 HIV patients with AIDS in the hospital.
Yeah, you're talking AIDS and all the related OIs or opportunistic infections. I mean, I always tell med students when they rotate with me, it's become, relative, I won't say simple, but going from multiple pills that don't really work multiple times a day to what we call STR, single tablet regimens.
Right.
Now we have injectable regimens, one injection every 90 days. It's really transformed. But tell me early on, I mean, how was it like back in those days when you just had AZT and not much else?
No, we didn't have AZT. This was before
that
AZT.
didn't come until the early 90s, right?
Yeah, AZT, I mean, came about in 87.
No.
So we didn't have anything.
But you were just treating the end result, the opportunistic infections, right?
And treating symptomatology.
Yep.
So what were we treating? We were treating fevers, nausea, rashes. Oh my God, like you wouldn't believe.
Diarrhea.
Wasting, I'm sure.
Diarrhea, horrible wasting. Yeah. And we were really chasing our tails.
I mean, the things that we could diagnose back then in the 80s was, the MAI.
Yes.
MAC, we could diagnose cryptosporidiosis from stool specimens.
How about cryptococcal meningitis?
We did.
We saw that all the time.
All the time.
Oh my God.
With seizures, altered mental status. Yeah.
Amphotericin.
Bad fevers and change of mental status.
Amphotericin, where you didn't have much. There was none of the new antifungals.
Nope. Fluconazole was developed while we were in the 90s when we were in Lenox Hill. All we had was amphotericin.
How about for PCP? Did you use pentamidine, the inhaled pentamidine?
I worked on that study actually, believe it or not.
She did.
Pentamidine is really a very difficult drug. So we tried hard to desensitize people to Bactrim to try to get them on Bactrim.
But it can cause pneumothorax and things like that. So it's
well, I mean, not to mention its effect on kidneys and it's a toxic drug.
And also blood sugars used to plummet. We didn't know that. When I was working in an ICU for a short time before I joined St. Clair's, and a pentamidine would be shipped directly from the CDC in a syringe to be given IM. That was probably back in '84, and we didn't know this at the time, but all of a sudden we had a patient whose blood sugar was like 20, and it was from the pentamidine. Unfortunately, as soon as people developed an allergic reaction to Bactrim, rather than treating through it with steroids, we just said, okay, you're allergic, and we switched right away to IV pentamidine, which was the absolute wrong thing to do. It was only much later that we desensitized people to Bactrim.
The pentamidine, the hypoglycemia, they always ask on the ID boards, even though we don't use pentamidine anymore. We use Tovacor or Mepron is a drug of choice. And of course, we don't even see it so much anymore because people that are compliant, I always tell my patients they should die of something of old age, diabetes, heart attack, stroke, not anything related to HIV. It's really
been a long time since I've seen anybody with an OI. And I worked in ID up until a month ago.
Well, fast forwarding to today and how we're dealing with the pandemic, did you, having experienced the HIV/AIDS epidemic, were you surprised by how our pandemic currently is dealt with, or like any lessons learned,
right,
or would have done?
Well, I mean, you know, politically, you know, what was going on politically, which, and our books are really not political. Politically, what was going on was the problem, you know, with the lack of PPE. I mean, we didn't have, you know, we didn't have a lack of PPE back in the late 70s, early 80s. You know, people just overused it. I mean, when it wasn't even necessary most of the time. You know, standard precautions are now took the place of, you know, I worked in another hospital ICU where, you know, we were told by the medical director, gown, glove, booties, OR hats, double gloves, double gowns. I mean, there were people that were, I recounted one, there's a small chapter in the book where they wouldn't trach anybody with HIV who was on a ventilator. They would not perform a tracheostomy. They would not contaminate their OR. There was one patient who finally was scheduled for a tracheostomy, and the respiratory therapist would not give us an ambu bag with a PEEP valve. So, and these patients early on were on such high levels of PEEP. Yeah, and that the patient died on the way to the OR because the ambu bag we had didn't give any PEEP. So,
well, I'll tell you, early on in the COVID pandemic, you know, because we were still, our institution was labeled the epicenter in northern New Jersey, or even the New York tri-state. And at one time we had over 100 patients in a pop-up ICU, you know, all intubated. It was like something, it was incredible. When I say incredible, it was incredibly sad to see. But before anyone knew what was really happening, you know, besides ER docs, ICU docs, ID, renal, no one else was really in the hospital. And then, you know, Clinton can tell you some of these patients will go into renal failure because of remdesivir, and they need to be on hemodialysis, and it became very challenging. Do we even dialyze these patients? Will any vascular surgeon come in to put in a vas cath? So I see these we were talking about similarities there, are, because
people didn't want to go in the rooms. So.
Right, or people would say, look, this patient's too sick, we have to triage, we can't save this patient. You know, there was concerns of intubating patients and aerosolizing COVID-19 before we had a better understanding of what was happening. So,
yeah, initially we had to, I remember fighting with doctors who wouldn't want to get up and see the patient. Like, you know, this patient needs this procedure.
People were really sick. They were, I mean, and scared. The healthcare providers were really scared.
Right.
I mean, I was actually sent home because I was the oldest one in the unit. I'm well over 65. So they said, okay, you get to work from home. And I said, well, what? So as soon as COVID hit, I wasn't allowed to see patients. I'm a nurse practitioner. And like 2 days before, I was seeing like 5 people with fevers and a cough. And now all of a sudden I wasn't allowed to see patients anymore. So.
You were talking about politics. I just had a question. Because I always tell people, you know, for COVID-19, it's the first pandemic in the social media era. And I don't have to tell our viewers or tell you how everything's been politicized, whether it's testing, whether it's vaccines, whether the fact that it happened during an election season, you know, what have you. But what were the politics in the early 80s, not just PPE? I mean, if I remember correctly, a lot of activists said it was ignored because of the vulnerable populations that it affected predominantly.
Exactly. If we hadn't had ACT UP, we would never have gotten anywhere.
That's right.
Tell us about that. I mean, was that a grassroots effort, or was that, I mean, how did that come about?
Yes.
Sure. It was,
ACT UP was
ACT UP and gay men's health crisis started probably about 1981, and then ACT UP with Larry Kramer and Peter Staley. You know, most of the gay population, they were using their voices. They were not going to go quietly. And they ended up speaking for other members of the population that got AIDS. What Ronald Reagan didn't mention AIDS until what? 85.
It was 2 years. You know? It was like 2 years into his. Oh no, it's the second term before he.
It was his second term. I remember that as a kid.
He wouldn't. That was very famous. Even say that.
Ignored it. Yeah.
Never said anything about it. There was money being given to it, so just so you should not think that nothing was being done. The NIH obtained funding. The AIDS Clinical Trials Group, of which I was a member for many years. Was funneled some of that money. The first AZT trials, the first DDI, the first DDC, all of those things went through the ACTG with NIH money. But it's not the kind of money that got thrown at COVID, let me tell you. There were, you know, I mean,
we had there were a lot of celebrities that jumped on the HIV bandwagon and raised money. Certainly Elizabeth Taylor, Elton John, you know, when Rock Hudson died, when Freddie Mercury died, you know, the Phoenix Mercury Foundation was started. So there was a
Hollywood got involved as well, right? I mean, Rock Hudson, I think very famously passed.
Magic Johnson. I mean,
that,
you know,
that was
when
my
we
recollection of HIV AIDS was when, you know, Magic Johnson at his press conference.
Right.
I was in elementary school. I think I was in 7th or 8th grade.
I spent more time on the phone with people after Magic Johnson's interview. Oh my God. It's amazing.
So, and now we have your background. I'd love to hear more about, and it's not just book, which is fascinating, books, right? One fiction and one nonfiction?
No, they're both the sort of the same. One is the HIV book is our lived experience, our that's our own story. And the second one was based on reality, but because we didn't live it, we wrote it as a novel.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the second novel. Second book is a work of fiction. What's the name of that book? Just so we can have our
Beyond the Mask.
Beyond the Mask.
And the first one, I would like to hear about the first one. The name of the first.
Nurses on the Inside: Stories of the HIV/AIDS epidemic in New York City.
What prompted you or inspired you? I think we know what inspired you. What prompted you to say, hey, you know, we need to put this story into print? Was it just the fact that you saw all the inaction initially, or some of
I mean, we wrote Nurses on the Inside. That came out in 2019. So we were writing it probably in 2017. You know, took multiple attempts to get it published, and we ended up with an indie publisher because, you know, most traditional publishers didn't think it was commercial enough, nor would it sell. But the impetus for that book, honestly, and I tell this story all the time, is I had a reunion with people that I went to grade school with. So we went to each other's bat mitzvahs. And when we went around the room and said, okay, what have you been doing for the last 50 years? I said, I was a nurse for 15 years in the HIV epidemic. And then one of my friends said, you should write a book. And I said, I'm not, you know, I'm not an author. I don't write, you know. And then, I don't know, a couple months later, I just sat down on my computer and I realized how many memories were flooding back to me. I mean, names, dates, birthdays, dates of passing that I remembered, you know, specific patient scenarios. I mean, I just remembered them. And since that time, I've taken care of thousands of critical care patients, none of whom I remember, as well as I remembered the patients with HIV that I took care of in the 80s and 90s. I remembered their names. I remember when they died. I remember
those memories are just kind of burned. They
will be there forever. I mean,
and
forever.
you would assume that something like that would never happen again, and that wouldn't be relevant. But like now, it's like that should be mandatory reading for.
Well, can I tell you, the way we ended the book was how we thought that this might come around again, and little did we know that less than 2 years later it would come around again.
Yeah.
How do you go about writing? This is a separate note. How do you go about putting words on the paper? You know, because,
actually, you can use a pencil and a paper, or you can type. Some people actually just
what
type.
I meant was,
I carved it into a block of wood myself. But,
did you do all the writing yourself?
I whittled it.
I have this dream where, like, I'm gonna sit in a coffee shop, take a hiatus from work, and just drink coffee and write my memoirs. And then, you know,
do you have long flowing hair in your dream? How's the hair?
Yes, it's gonna be a Bollywood. It's gonna be made to a Bollywood made for TV movie. The whole thing.
Dancers in the background. That'd be cool.
That's right. But all kidding aside, how I think it's fascinating that you took this idea. You said, hey, I really want to put this to print, but how do you? What's the actual? I think a lot of people may think that way, but how do you actually go about it?
I wrote what I remembered in the first person. You know.
First person, yeah.
I wrote it in the first person, and then I would send it to Valery, and she wrote it in the first person. When we ultimately ended up signing with an indie publisher, they wanted us to turn it into third person.
And novelize it more.
Well, and novelize it, yes. I'm sorry, there's somebody mowing their lawn back there, so that's the noise. But they
and sensationalize it. Yes.
Yes, it was. Yes, we went with an indie publisher who are probably about your ages, who really, from Ohio, who really had probably never met a gay person in their life, and they wanted to sensationalize a lot of it. And then finally, we just put our foot down and said, no, we'll turn it into the third person and we'll rewrite it. So that's what ultimately happened, is we did have to take control, because otherwise we would have had some, very outlandish, cliche, hackneyed expressions, which we did not want. We wanted it to be close to our lives because it is our personal story.
You want to be true to yourself, yeah, sure.
So one of the things that they wanted to do is, because I'm gay, they wanted to sort of sensationalize my romance with my wife, and
like a love story, and
it was like a love story, yes. And it, I said no thanks. I mean, it's in there. There's some things in there, but it's not.
It's factual, yes.
Yes. We wanted to stick with the facts. We didn't, again, all the hackneyed expressions, the love bug.
No bullshit dialogue.
Yeah. We too are no bullshit people. We don't want any nonsense floating around. So, and then with the second book, I did a lot of the interviewing.
The second book, when did you start the second book?
Well, the second book just came out earlier this year.
Yeah, but we started it in April or May of 2020.
2020.
So I was working on the remdesivir study at the time. And so what I was doing was chart reviews and data extraction. And so I was, familiar with the medical histories of everybody who was admitted to the hospital where I worked at the time. And that was quite a big deal. And it was, when I say that I was really anxious about the world falling apart, I really thought it was the end of the world. And I needed to be busy. So actually working 17 hours a day on remdesivir wasn't enough. I had to fill the rest of the hours of the day with Ellen, going back and forth with Ellen about the book. But on a day-to-day basis, how we did it is that she wrote some stuff and sent it to me, and then I wrote some stuff and sent it to her. And sometimes if it needed a little polishing, I do that, or we had a friend who helped us with some of it also.
Tell us about the book, Beyond the Mask. It's 6 stories or one hospital?
Well, if you, I know you were quoting from the back of the book, which is the synopsis of the book. And basically we took six healthcare workers, nurses aides, and somebody from one of the allied professions, X-ray. And we did a lot of interviews, and we compiled multiple stories and created one character.
Okay.
So we have three separate units, and in any hospital you could imagine. We didn't choose the hospital; it's somewhere in New York, and
I always imagined where it was in Queens.
Yes, we did imagine where it was kind of after Elmhurst Hospital.
For Ellen, it was Elmhurst. For me, it was New York Hospital, Queens, which used to be called Booth Memorial. The hospital where we went when we were sick when I was a kid. But that's where I imagined it.
Right. I imagined Elmhurst because that was my first job when I worked there in critical care.
And when Elmhurst was such a pit of despair, and it still is, incidentally.
There was a nurse who secretly recorded stuff going on at Elmhurst Hospital and then posted it online.
Oh, like what, for instance? And now you piqued my interest here.
Well, there was a nurse who secretly recorded behind her doctors who were talking about patients saying, "Oh, this one's not going to make it. Let's keep going, keep going." And it really just stuff like that. People being denied meds. This one's too old. Keep going. There was a lot of stuff like that recorded.
Well, keeping in mind triage is a real thing.
Yes.
You know, I think that if you ever do read our book, there's a scene in the tent in the emergency room that I think was probably pretty real. And it was humane. It was not horrible. I mean, sometimes you just have to say, I'm not going to put you through the torment because it's going to be fruitless anyway.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that is true. There's a fine line between, you know, what might be deemed or viewed as inhumane or unjust, and what, you know, what ERs do is triage. And
Right.
I can tell you, in our ER, you know, we were having people being intubated in the hallway, right? There was patients. Our ICU was full. We never did quite run out of ventilators. We came very close. We had to bring out some very old ventilators, you know, from retirement, you know, and these patients were being intubated everywhere. And at some point we had to say, look, have conversation with palliative care and say, an 88-year-old is coming in, you know, and do we intubate this patient who's demented? You know, we need to understand that. Those conversations were being had.
They definitely were being had. And I'm not saying that it's a bad thing.
A lot of facilities were making decisions based on the resources they had. So I think it was just in the way that they were doing it.
My institution was well funded, and we had, to give you an idea, we have over 250 ORs alone, and every one of them was filled with a COVID patient. There was no surgery. Everybody, all those anesthesia machines were being used as respirators because all the ICU beds were filled.
Yeah, I mean, the people that we talked to, I mean, conference rooms were taken over with COVID patients. All the pediatric ICUs, pediatric units were taken over. Even some of the NICUs were taken over.
I don't know.
Our entire auditorium was made into a tent COVID unit. You know, remember?
Oh my God!
Yeah, they cleared out all the chairs, and then it was actually made as a auditorium, but also as a separate water supply, everything. So in case there was ever, you know, a major issue or mass casualty event, but this is a place I used to give grand rounds or attend lectures or give lectures or listen to lectures, and all of a sudden we have these 3 massive tents in there with all filled with COVID patients. It was
that's of course amazing.
Yeah, and then of course, you know, not allowing visitors to come in, so we were, you know, seeing people die alone. I held up the phone. I'm sure you did. Or
FaceTime.
That was the cruelest thing.
Yes, yeah.
My daughter told me all about that. You know, she was on an iPad and FaceTiming relatives, you know, and they were, you know, just stalking and just wandering around outside, wondering what to do. And, but I, you know, as far as the book is concerned, we memorialized the first 5 months of COVID, of the pandemic, from January 2020 to May 2020. And the reason that we did that is because people are beginning to forget again what it was like at the very beginning, just like they forgot or weren't born yet at the beginning of the AIDS epidemic. And, you know, certainly a lot of people that are in healthcare today were not born or around or in healthcare during the HIV epidemic. And we will find the same thing happening with the COVID pandemic. And, you know, people are used to having enough PPE right now, and people are used to, you know, there being swabs. I work in a skilled facility with my students now, and, you know, at the beginning we were swabbed twice a week, and then it was down once a week, and then if you weren't vaccinated, you got to get swabbed. And there was so many resources that then, you know, between 2021 and 2022 now that we have, and, you know, it's all changed. And at the beginning, you know, we wrote the book in kind of the first 3 chapters of emergency room critical care and an orthopedic unit, and like the calm before the storm, where strange things were happening. You know, all of a sudden one day the PPE was locked up, you know, and then you were assigned a certain amount of PPE.
We used to reuse our mask, and we were told to put it in these clear plastic bags, the air, the light would help.
UV lights,
longevity.
But you know, the problem is that nobody was told why. I mean, in nursing school, like we would be chastised if you so much as left a patient room wearing the mask and gloves. You were supposed to deglove, demask, degown, and throw it all out. And then if you had to go back in that same room, you used another set, you know, so this was completely foreign to everything we had ever learned.
And nobody ever said why. They just said, you can't have more.
You can't have
well, certainly communication was a big issue, right? Whether it was
bad
communication of doctors from the CDC of what to do,
right.
how long tests will be taken. You know, that messaging, I think, was set the wrong tone from the beginning of, and
Right.
kind of.
Well, a lot of that had to do with who was running the country at the time.
Clearly,
So,
clearly, but
yes.
The irony of it.
Well, go ahead.
Sorry, the irony of it now is we had all this access to information, quick information, early diagnostic tools. How long did it take for us to figure out a lot about COVID? It didn't take that long, right? But you guys were living through it through years, like years before
you even knew what the virus was, much less how to attack the virus.
And we're complaining about the scientists don't know what they're doing and you're giving wrong information. So just
So to
all of us.
give you an
Look
example.
at how fast we had a vaccine to produce.
Yeah, I mean, just to give you an example of the difference in the timeline, we saw our first patients in 1979. We didn't get an antiretroviral, only one, until 1987. It wasn't widely available until 1989. Wow. We got the second one almost, let me see.
Was that DDI or?
Yeah, the second one was DDI.
DDI.
And then I can remember having this whole big argument with Gabe Torres, who was a big ID fellow at the time. I mean, when I say fellow, he wasn't attending, but
sure, about
whether we use the drugs sequentially or together. Now, obviously,
always together, right?
Always, well, not AZT and DDI anymore.
No, but you use, you know, combination. We used to call heart now. Yeah, combination antiretroviral therapy.
Yeah,
sure.
And so then it took until 1995 to get a viral load. We didn't know what we were doing. We were looking in the rear view mirror with T cells for all that time.
And I'll tell you, that's why I felt very discouraged when all, you know, fast forward to now with the sharing information globally. The virus SARS-CoV-2 was sequenced by the middle of January, and it was only described to WHO December 31st, 2019. It was already sequenced about this later. By sequencing, you could say, okay, it's a coronavirus, family virus, it's an RNA virus. They start working on antivirals like Gilead's remdesivir, repurposing it from, you know, initially looked at for Ebola and other things. And yet people still said, well, you know, these are coming in, you know, this is all, we can't trust the scientific establishment. And it was very disheartening, you know, because on one hand, you have all this great sharing of scientific data, and now we have the ability to sequence RNA, you know, the RNA vaccines, which are just incredible, right? Just to have this technology available. It was very disheartening to see how it had become politicized. So
yes, it was shocking.
Yeah, for sure. But I would love to know, you know, because clearly in our time here, we've established all your experience and obviously why you would be well qualified to write books. So where can we find this?
Oh, wait. Before you get into that, I have an idea for a new book, I think.
Oh, you do?
Yeah, right, let's hear it. The protagonist is a youthful, amazingly handsome kidney doctor. And he's fighting an evil, old, infectious disease doctor who's trying to take over the world. Yes.
You both get perm caps for that.
Oh. Not a pick.
You know, it's interesting in the facility that I am working with students at. What we are seeing now is patients with long COVID who were treated. Yes. You know, I work on a ventilator unit, so they are trached, pegged, and on dialysis. The patients who have had long COVID, who were treated excessively with remdesivir and steroids, and now we're seeing the long COVID patient in the skilled facility, and that's a shame.
It is. There's actually now opening throughout New York City, and we're part of my hat here is also running a lot of clinical trials. Our medical director of our research institute, but you know, there's a lot of interest now in long COVID, and depending on who you ask, between 20 and 30% of all patients will have some aspects of long COVID, whether it's headaches now, especially with Omicron, chronic cough, exercise intolerance, etc., or you know, neurological issues, neuropathy, alterations in taste and smell. It's a very big issue, and as more and more the population now gets natural immunity from COVID by natural infection, we're going to see more and more people dealing with this. But you know, I feel like we could talk all day about all your experiences. I would like to, you know, end by first of all thanking you both for all your hard work. And I will tell you, as an ID doc, you know, and obviously I trained in 2000s, right? So, but hearing all the stories of what it was like in the late 70s and 80s with limited resources, without even understanding, you know, the true nature of this disease, is really incredible. You know, by the time I got there, yes, I put central lines in plenty of HIV patients. Yes, we double gloved. I knew people that had to take PrEP, or, you know, a post-exposure prophylaxis, or now we have PrEP, pre-exposure prophylaxis. None of that existed in your time. And yet you guys put yourselves in harm's way for a disease that no one really understood. So that is incredibly admirable. So,
and no one probably put a sign on your yard. I mean, you guys are really true heroes. And
no, nobody put us. Not that I have a yard. I mean, I live in Manhattan.
Or you got a discount at Nike. I get discounts because I'm a healthcare hero. But you guys are the true heroes.
It's interesting though. When some of the very kind rejections we got from potential agents that I sent the manuscript to, of Nurses on the Inside, they sent us back, you know, you are true heroes, like soldiers coming back from war, and but we're not going to publish your book. Right. And you know, I can say that I speak for both of us, is that, you know, we never considered that, you know, we never considered us heroes. I mean, we had a job to do, and we put one foot in front of the other, and Valery and I, we worked together for so long, you know, almost 20 years, and we helped each other. And I called her from a different department, and I said, I need help with this patient, and she would call me and say, have you got a bed for this patient? And, you know, we just collaborated our entire career through HIV, you know, including when we were both administrators of HIV programs, and we both would put on scrubs and go and figure out how to contain severe cryptosporidiosis on a patient, you know, trying Foley's as rectal tubes. And, you know, I mean, we did this. It's all in the book. It's the books are on Amazon. And
so they're on Amazon. You can you go well, first of all, is there a Cliff Notes? Because I know Clinton sometimes has a short attention span.
Audiobooks.
They're very short. You'll be able to get through them in a very short period of time.
Are they available both in print as well as electronically as well?
Ebooks and print, yeah, both of them. But yeah, you know,
they're short. We didn't want to overwhelm people.
Listen, if you're in the healthcare field, you should be reading. This is mandatory literature.
We hope, you know, we hope so. I mean, we hope so that people will take our work seriously. You know, we always are looking for influencers to get our word out there and get our experiences out there. And, you know, if you look at Amazon, you know, we have 190 something reviews of Nurses on the Inside, and we have about 18 or so reviews now of Beyond the Mask. And a lot of people have written that they've appreciated the back and forth between nonfiction and fiction in Beyond the Mask, that we were able to tie together, you know, some kind of fictional characters with the reality, because the reality is that when I interviewed nurses like from Maryland, Nevada, Texas, just to name a few places that we interviewed on Facebook Messenger or text or phone call, they didn't want to give their name. They said, if you use my name or place where I work, I can't authorize you to do anything. Yeah. So when we were querying for an agent for this book, they said, why can't it be nonfiction? It has to be nonfiction, right, and then I'll represent you. And I said, because it can't. Because nursing is a small community. Even though we're a huge community, we are a small community. And I'm not outing any one of my colleagues from any state, you know, to mention anything that may be
detrimental to their
career. You know, nurses were fired because they wanted to wear hospital scrubs. You know, they didn't want to wear their own uniform. They wanted to wear hospital scrubs. There was a nurse in Texas that was fired for that.
Or if they were concerned about the lack of PPE and they called out.
And they talked about it. Yes, they talked about it on the pretense that we would not mention who they were or where they worked. And that's why we had to
so a lot of the stories, you know, I fleshed it out a little bit with stories from my patients and other nurses that I knew that were not at all involved and weren't even the same gender, maybe. I really sort of switched everything around. But I did a lot of backstories on people just to try to set the scene. But that's all fiction. So,
but you know, the stories that you were telling are of utmost importance. Clearly, anything we can do to help, certainly we'll post links on our YouTube channel, and you know, anyone that and put as well as in the summaries of this podcast episode. So it'll be our pleasure to
thank you.
Thank you very much.
It's so important, and you can just sense, and Clinton and I can both just sense the enthusiasm, the passion, and then of course it just rings through all your experience. So I have to tell you, it was a real pleasure to have you both.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah. So you know, from my esteemed colleague, Dr. Clenton Coleman, I'm Dr. Suraj Saggar. This is Recommend Daily Dose. Thank you so much to our guests today. Please support their books. We'll post links on our YouTube channel. Please don't forget to rate, listen, and subscribe to Recommend Daily Dose. Until next time, be well.